Hello everyone, my name is Sean. I will be the moderator for today. Thank you all for coming to the third session today. I know it's late in the day and not exactly the best time of the week to be listening to questions about justice, liberalism, very heavy things. But this opportunity is a pretty special one because we have with us Professor Chandran Khukatas. Professor he is the chair in political theory at the London School of Economics. He did his BA in History and Political Science at the Australian National University, went on to do a MA in Politics at the University of New South Wales, and before going on to do his DPhil in Politics at Oxford. Professor Khukatas has taught at the Royal Military College in Canberra, taught at Oxford, he has taught at ANU, and has taught at the University of New South Wales as well as the University of Utah, where he held the Neil Maxwell Chair in Political Theory. Now, without further ado, I'm going to begin the session. In terms of the structure of this session, how it will work out is I will have a conversation with Prof about Prof's theory for about half an hour to 45 minutes. After which I will invite the speakers from this morning's sessions, Hasman, Imran and Dr. Masli, to join us on the panel, and I will have an open Q&A discussion. Open is a slight misnomer because I am of the firm personal view that I like to structure the Q&A slightly, just to give a bit more structure to the discussion and to ensure a bit more deep discussion. So I will explain a bit more about Q&A when we get to Q&A. So, Prof, to start things off, I think everyone has spent hours in the morning and the afternoon talking about justice. I want to take a step back and looking at things from a more meta perspective. Do you think that talking about justice, talking about how ought society distribute its resources, what sort of values should a just society believe in, are those the right questions to ask? I mean, they have been talking about the answers, but perhaps you should step back and ask whether those are the right questions to ask in the first place.
I don't think it's never the right question to ask. It does depend very much on the circumstances or the context in which discussion is taking place, whether you make the question one about justice. The problem with making justice the framework for the discussion, for the exploration of an issue or for a debate, is that if you're living or operating in a context where values are very diverse and understandings of bases for distribution, for example, are diverse, if you're talking about distribution as the issue, then you're almost invariably going to get many different conceptions of justice, many theories of justice. Now, in those circumstances, it's difficult to say, well, what we'll do is we'll just figure out what is the right theory of justice, because by hypothesis, there are many different theories of justice around there. Now, of course, what you could say is, well, what we'll do is we will devote our time to arguing about this, and out of this debate and discussion, the right theory of justice will emerge. Now, there's no reason why this couldn't in principle, but I think in practical terms, there are lots of reasons why this is not going to happen. One reason is simply that in advancing their theories of justice, some people will be averting to arguments that really suit their own particular interests. In some cases, it will be the fact that people actually have different ethical starting points for thinking about justice. They've got different views about how to think about, for example, the nature of the individual, the relationship between the individual and the community, the nature of the ultimate values that distribution should be pitched at. Now, if this is the case, the problem with focusing on justice as the center of your attention is that you either end up talking past one another, or you end up trying to secure one particular conception of justice that some people might accept, but that others simply will not, in which case justice becomes a means of enforcing a view which most people don't accept. Now, one way to try to resolve this problem is the way that John Rawls attempted. And this is what I think many of you have been looking at during the day today. And the crucial thing about Rawls is that he saw this problem. And he thought, well, maybe what we can do is we can think of justice as that moral understanding that comes out of people coming together and thinking about what kind of view of justice all of them could accept. Now, when he first conceived of this, he thought, maybe think about people as bargainers in a game. Okay? And the right theory of justice would be the one that they concluded the bargain with. He eventually abandoned that because he thought that the bargaining metaphor was not the right one. But he tried to retain this insight. That is to say, the theory of justice that's the appropriate one is the theory which everybody could accept. And that's not a bad strategy, but to go back to my original point about the problem with the fact that there are different conceptions of justice or different understanding of justice or values, the problem with that is that if you're actually going to secure agreement on the conception of justice, there must be some basis for your reaching agreement. There has got to be some set of background values that's going to make this possible. Now here the problem is that the wider the range of values you're trying to incorporate, the harder it is to reach agreement. But if you narrow the range of values that you admit into the discussion, the easier it is to reach agreement, but the more difficult it is then to do so without excluding a whole range of things, a whole range of perspectives. So this is why I think if you focus on the notion of justice, you will either end up, if you're adopting this particular strategy, having a conception that is so narrow that too many people are excluded, or you will end up having something which really in the end does not qualify as a theory of justice, because it will turn out to be something else. It will be some sort of set of norms which incorporates a whole range of particular values.
Now, Prof, to focus a bit on Rawls' theory in particular. Now, Rawls was not unaware of this problem.
Yes.
And he tried very hard to avoid it. And to the end, he maintained that his theory was free from this problem, that his political conception of justice was not dependent on any sort of personal conception of justice which abound in our society, that it's some kind of neutral conception of justice that anyone in the original position behind the veil of ignorance would agree to, regardless of their own personal fundamental beliefs about morality, about justice. But why do you think then that in some way there is a hidden, and how, well, do you think that, firstly, do you think then that there is some hidden conception of justice embedded within Rawls' work? And how exactly is this hidden conception of justice embedded within Rawls' theory about parties bargaining and agreeing to this supposedly political and neutral conception of justice?
Okay. Well, it's not hidden, but it's a solution that he comes up with that really does suffer from one of these two problems that I mentioned. It's either going to be so inclusive that it can only manage by extending the theory to a point that it's very, very general, or it's going to be very, very precise as a theory of justice, but at the cost of excluding many people. What Rawls really ended up doing is responding to this criticism by saying, you know, that's right. What I'm coming up with is not a universal theory. What it is really is a theory that speaks to a particular people in a particular historical period. The bargain that he imagines, or the agreement he imagines, is one that takes place among people who share a certain number of background assumptions, background values, so they can actually reach agreement. So when he constructs the original position, what he's trying to do is to articulate this. Now, what is the relevant society then? It's basically the United States in the late 20th century. He says, by this stage, the United States has reached a point where it has, in fact, embodied in its practice a number of values. Central to this is a certain understanding of freedom and a certain understanding of equality. It's a society which has abandoned slavery. It is a society that's tried to promote civil rights. It's a society that's tried to ensure certain sorts of economic equalities. So this is the society that he's trying to articulate a political theory for, in the form of a theory of justice. Now, of course, the problem is that the United States, despite this set of shared values, is also a society in which there are many other people with different values. There are many religious traditions, from Jewish to Muslim to Hindus and Christians. There are many different denominations of Christians. There are atheists. But also, ideologically, there are people who are socialists and communists, as well as people who are conservatives and libertarians, people who are liberals and Democrats. Now, all of these people don't necessarily buy into Rawls's theory. But what Rawls has tried to do is to shape the theory in such a way that he thinks it's going to bring together a kind of consensus that can incorporate all these different perspectives. But what he also concedes is that some of these perspectives won't be included because some of them simply in the end won't buy his theory. And what he says about some of them is that, well, they don't get included in this theory. They don't get included as people who will, in fact, endorse this theory. Now, the problem then is that if that's the case, how can you say that this is a theory of justice that can, in fact, appeal to the society as a whole? Because then it looks awfully like it's simply either a section of the community that's making the running and saying this is what justice is, or perhaps it's the majority that's making the running. In either case, you're excluding a certain number of people. Okay? Now, what Rawls wants to say is that this is actually as close as you're going to get, and it's pretty good, because there is a very broad consensus. But, so there are two problems to it. One is that some people are going to get excluded, and secondly, you've bought what inclusion you've got by really narrowing the focus of the theory. So it's no longer a theory of justice as such. It's really a theory that tries to justify the existing set of institutions, which are the ones that people all already accept. And maybe one thing one might worry about here is that such a theory, by essentially trying to articulate the values implicit in existing institutions, will turn out to be a very conservative theory, one which perhaps lacks a certain kind of critical edge. Not that it will have none, because it will still be the basis for criticizing some arrangements, but ultimately it's a view that seems to say, well, we start with the values that we've already got, and that's where we stay. So if you're someone who's interested in reform at a deeper level, this might not be the theory that really does very much for you. And in fact, in that respect, bringing this up as a theory of justice is to bring up a theory which really is not a theory you can use to interrogate, question, or challenge the institutions of your society. It's really a theory that tells you why you should embrace the institutions.
And of course, Prof, you've spoken about the divisions intra-America. But of course, America isn't necessarily the best model to use for the rest of the world as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It may not even be the best model for America.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. So, and you spoke about how Rawls thinks that this is the best sort of overlapping consensus you can ever get. What is your take on this? I mean, can we go further and come up with some form of theory which is more universal than this?
Well, there are two things here, really. I mean, you can ask whether it's possible to get a more universal theory, and that's certainly a question that many people have explored. But you could also ask the question, well, should we be trying to find a universal theory? And let me start with the second concern first, because one of the problems with searching for a universal theory is that the person doing the searching is very likely to find universality in his own particularity. You know, there's the joke that if a triangle had a god, it would have three sides. It's not surprising that when Europeans were looking for universal theories, they found it in understandings that were, in a sense, implicit in Christian traditions. So when European settlers went to the New World and preached to the Native Americans, what they told them was that here are the rights that you have and here are the rights you don't have, and these are universal truths. And we know these are universal truths because the best minds in our tradition have investigated these things, and we've established to our own satisfaction that these are universal truths. Well, why should one believe anyone who goes around saying there are certain universal truths? Particularly when one thinks about the fact that the world is so diverse that there are all kinds of different ways of thinking, different ways of being, and so on. Now, that isn't to say that that means that there are no common moral standards, that there aren't things that people everywhere seem to agree on. But the fact that there are some things that everyone seems to agree on does not suffice to actually develop something as complicated as a conception of justice that might be universally accepted. Even if you took something as seemingly straightforward as norms about killing, you might say, look, everybody thinks that murder is wrong. Well, you shouldn't really say murder, because murder by definition is unlawful killing, but everyone says that killing is wrong. Well, of course they don't. I mean, some people think that abortion is murder, others think that it's justifiable killing, yet others think that the fetus is not even a person, so there's no question of killing. There are different views about capital punishment. There are many different views about when you can legitimately kill in warfare. So it's very difficult to find universal values or universal truths which are in fact universally accepted. Let me give you one other example. Iran is a signatory to most of the UN treaties, including treaties which specify what counts as cruel and unusual punishment. But when it had the practice of cutting off the hands of people who were caught stealing, they were brought to task, and they were told they were failing to comply with the with the treaty, but they responded, no, we're not. We take the treaty very seriously, but we think this is not a misinterpretation. This is. Now, you might all accept the norm in principle, but how are you going to interpret it? If it's possible to interpret something with that degree of latitude, then it makes it difficult to say, well, yes, there are universal values. Everybody values friendship, you might say. But they may all think very differently about what friendship is. What friendship is in ancient Greece or in modern America might be different to the way, say, an Aboriginal community conceives of friendship. So looking for the universal is not as easy a thing to do for all kinds of reasons, among them the ones I've just mentioned.
And moving on to the sort of subject of fundamental liberties. Obviously, if the quest for a universal theory of justice is inevitably, I could say fruitless one, then the quest for universal liberties and rights, which would be justified by that theory of justice, will also be a futile one. And so, of course, Rawls, in his first principle, talks about equal scheme of basic liberties to everyone. So, Prof, it would be your contention then that that sort of prescription is really one which is confined by the American experience and one that is not truly universal in that sense.
This particular approach or methodology is, I think, one that has some of these flaws that I mentioned. And I think consequently, and maybe this is the point that you're making, trying to defend something like liberty by appeal to this larger conception is going to be problematic, because that means that if you don't buy into this larger theory, you've got no reason to accept the case for freedom. But of course there are other ways of defending, let's just stick with the idea of freedom, with defending this particular idea. One can certainly do it in the context of particular circumstances that one finds oneself in the context of a particular debate. If, for example, a government wants to limit some particular liberty, it seems to me that it's open to say to the government, well, what warrant have you got for making this restriction? Here are a whole number of reasons why perhaps you shouldn't be limiting. Firstly, limiting someone's freedom is causing a positive harm to that particular person. Why would you want to do this? Is there some greater good that's being promoted by this? Is it appropriate, even for the greater good, to make some set of people sacrifice themselves? Now, if the response to any set liberty is not a value at all, well, that can still be questioned, challenged within the terms of that particular claim itself, but also in terms of other things that the community of interlocutors on this issue might well accept. I mean, let's say you took the case in Malaysia, supposing that a government says that we're going to restrict these particular liberties, and this is what Malaysians want. Well, I don't think you need to appeal to Rawls's theory. You can start it by saying, well, is this really what all Malaysians want? Clearly, some Malaysians don't want this. What's the justification that you're going to give? What is the warrant for harming these Malaysians? And if it does benefit some other Malaysians, why is that a sufficient reason? Just because some people are gaining doesn't mean that others need to be limited. If the argument is put that, well, these are ultimately Malaysian values, you can say, well, they seem to be values that a lot of Malaysians don't accept. So what is the warrant for claiming that these are Malaysian values? And what makes you think that your interpretation of this is the authority? There are all kinds of ways of engaging. And I think ultimately, in any society, if you're going to make arguments about values. You've got to do the arguing in terms that people can accept and acknowledge. Because if you simply appeal to a more abstract theory, unless the premises are ones that people do in fact accept, you're not going to get very far with your arguments.
In that case, let's take the example of a so-called liberal society, for example, and try to figure out what sort of values would be shared in a liberal society. Obviously, Rawls has quite complicated explanations about the right to free speech, the right to free association. Those are the things that he thinks in a liberal society. Those are the things that the values of the society would hold paramount. What is your view on these rights in a liberal society? Whether a liberal society actually requires these values to be held paramount?
Okay. I'm going to give you an answer which begins in the first instance by raising a doubt about the whole idea of a society. It's not that I want to deny the existence of societies in principle, but when you start the discussion by talking about a liberal society, it sounds very much as if you're talking about something that's bounded. That this is somehow sealed or closed. But of course, human society, in a sense, is continuous. Political boundaries may well exist. Jurisdictions are to be found everywhere. But these jurisdictional boundaries don't close a society, because a society exists when people interact and associate, which they constantly do across all kinds of boundaries. They do it very easily across the boundaries of things like counties. They do it across the boundaries of provinces. Between Selangor and Perak, there's still interaction and trade. But they also do it across national boundaries. You can see very clearly in Europe, for example, in the Schengen area, because people just move freely from one place to another. People live in a country and work in another. They trade with one another quite freely. Goods move back and forth. Labor moves back and forth. So if you're going to talk about a liberal society, it's not necessarily the case that the entity in question is something like a state. And I'm raising this because I think when many people talk about a liberal society, they're really talking about a liberal state. Now, when Rawls talks about this, he wants to think about it in terms of the liberal state, because he conceives of the subject matter of his theory, which is to say, the appropriate institutions for a particular political society. He conceives of this as a closed society. And those are his words, not mine. And what I want to say really is that if we're going to think about a liberal society, we need to move away from this. Because a liberal, let's call it social order, or a liberal realm, is one in which there isn't this closedness. Okay? There isn't this attempt to confine people within particular boundaries, and certainly not an attempt to say that first and foremost they are members of some particular entity, which precludes their cooperating with others, except on terms that the people in this particular subset of humanity deem appropriate. Now, once you start thinking about a liberal society in those terms, I think justice becomes a much more difficult concept to put at the center of the theory, because justice, as we've seen from the critique of Rawls, really does presuppose having some kind of closely agreed, shared values. But once you broaden the scope to a much greater realm, well, people do have very different views about justice, different views about the proper basis for distribution, but who is deserving and who is not, what kinds of liberties are important. Now, if that's the case, if you're going to still have a society in which people can interact and cooperate, it seems to me you need to describe this with some different kind of concept. Now, I myself prefer a concept like toleration, but I don't think in the end the term is the critical thing. But what I would prefer to think of it as is a society in the broadest sense, in which different norms of justice can coexist, but still enable people to associate, cooperate, interact in all kinds of ways. So, from my point of view, this is the way to try to think about society and moral and political values.
So, Prof, I might be at risk of oversimplifying your ideas here, but it seems to me that you're saying that really the most important freedom is really the freedom to choose what freedoms you want.
That's one way of putting it, I think. I would only be a little bit careful about it because it presupposes that every society will in fact value freedom in the same way and to the same degree. And there may be societies and groups of people for whom freedom is much less important, particularly the freedom to choose, because there are differences in understandings about what freedoms you do generally have as freedoms to choose. Now, I myself would like to see societies having much greater inclination to admit the kinds of freedoms that we find in societies like Britain, the United States, and Australia, and so on. But I recognize there are many places and many traditions which aren't going to think about freedom in exactly the same way. But that said, I think it's not a bad way of thinking about it, because I think it picks out something that's really quite important, and that is that given this diversity of values, given this variety of outlooks, it's very difficult then for any one individual group or sector of a community or a society or a state to come out and say, look, we are actually decisive and authoritative interpreters of what the people think in this particular area. It's very difficult for a member of a state or a government of the state to say, look, we are the decisive interpreters. It may be easier in some states. I mean, maybe in Tibet, for example, where it's independent, there'd be sufficient commonality of outlook that you could do certain things. And certainly in some countries where there are more homogeneous populations, that might be easier. But in any society that has a moderate amount of diversity, it becomes very difficult for a government to turn around and say, we are the decisive interpreters.
And you would say then that the crucial thing for people in such societies is for them to associate with the values that they themselves hold dear, that they have the freedom of choice to actually choose what sort of values they hold dear.
Well, they won't so much choose their values. Most of the values that we have, we don't choose in the sense of making kind of initial or radical decision about. We don't make it and say, I think today I value freedom, or today I'm going to value piety. You have particular values because you've grown up with them, you've inculcated them in somebody else, and that person now has them. But they're not things that you simply choose. So it's not the choosing that's the critical thing. I think what's important really is that given that people do have different values, that we find some way of negotiating these differences. So I think the explanation about how you negotiate this is not to say, well, everybody gets to choose which values, because they're not really choosing them, but no one really has some kind of special authority to say that these are the values that are going to hold. And I think the values that will come to be embraced will never be values that are just individually embraced, and so-and-so decides to value this, and so-and-so decides to value that. Because all of these values come into existence and come to have a point as a result of people's interaction. And it'll be very weird to have a society in which each individual has his own personal values. The values that they have are things that they've arrived at because of the fact that they have to associate and engage with other human beings. I mean, if you were Robinson Crusoe, you don't need to have any values. You only need them because there are other people around you. That's what the values pick out. They tell you what it is that you should do in a world of human beings. So many of the things that people, in a sense, accept as values are really going to be the product of compromise. And they result in also often be transformed by interaction.
But Prof, moving this to the real world, for example, I mean, there is a lot of social tension that goes on. And some of this social tension is because some citizens' personal values don't align with society's compromise. The compromise of values that society reaches.
Yeah.
So how then should society treat these people who don't necessarily agree with society's compromise of values? So you know, quote unquote, how should a illiberal society treat those who are liberal, and how should a liberal society treat those who are illiberal?
Okay. So the view that I'm defending about the nature of a good society, which is emphasized its nature as something that transcends different boundaries and involves interaction between many different values. In a sense, it's a kind of liberal society. That's how I would describe it. But it's a society that could also, perhaps even almost necessarily, will include within it many different societies, communities, groups, which are more or less liberal. And I think the attitude of that wider society is liberal to the extent that it says, well, we live and let live. Okay? Those who don't embrace these values but are willing to live peacefully, cooperate with one another in their own terms, we will simply accept. Now, if you're talking about an illiberal society and the attitude that it should take to liberal ones, I think it should also take that same attitude. Now, in that sense, you might say, well, aren't you really just asking it too to become a kind of liberal society? And I think the answer here is yes, but I think it's less of a problem for my version of liberalism than it is, say, for the Rawlsian version of liberalism. Because the version of liberalism I'm presenting is one that says, look, you're liberal if you're prepared to accept people who are different in your midst and cooperate with them, but allow them to go their own way. Okay? That's all you need to do to be a liberal. You don't need to be a deep liberal. Okay? So you can accept, in that case, people who are not, as it were, members of the faith, provided that they are willing to respect your own traditions and so on. So a good example of this outlook, although not perfect, say, is the attitude of Islam in one sense, or to take a more real-world case, more political case, the case of the Ottoman Empire, which had within it many different political communities which were not Muslim. The empire itself was a Muslim empire. its attitude towards Christians and Jews was essentially that you paid a slightly higher rate of tax, but you kept to your own traditions and so on. Now, there were many more complications. What happened when, let's say, there was a conflict between a Muslim and a Christian? Well, they had to go to a Muslim court. So it's not as if it's completely the case that the non-Muslim communities could go their own way. But nonetheless, the principle, I think, you can see. So, to me, that gives you a kind of model that a society that isn't deeply liberal should still adopt. It should adopt this minimal sense of liberalism, which is essentially a recognition of the plurality of values, and then a willingness to tolerate difference and recognize that people live by different traditions. Now, as far as those who are themselves members of the liberal society but not part of the liberal minority, they too may have a concern in this illiberal society because they may want it to be more deeply liberal, but then they have the responsibility and hopefully the opportunity to try to change that internally. But that may be one of the most difficult things to do.
In the real world, there are sections of humanity which are fundamentally opposed to this idea of toleration.
Yes.
So, of course, there are people who like you said, are somewhat liberal in the sense that although they hold pretty deeply held views, they nevertheless recognize that that there are other deeply held views out there, and they respect those views. But on the other hand, there are people in the world who are willing to wage war on the basis of their own deeply held views, and they are willing to kill other people who don't share the same views. So how should society treat them? I mean, their belief that they can wage war is in itself a belief.
Mm-hmm.
How should society treat these beliefs which are so diametrically opposed to toleration?
Mm-hmm. Well, to the extent that what you're dealing with is their beliefs, the only way I think to deal with it is to engage in conversation and dialogue. Because if they're expressing their beliefs, the only way to address someone's beliefs is to say, let's talk about this, okay, and I see things differently. Now, you've got a different problem if their response is, no, we don't want to engage in this because there's no point, you're simply in the wrong, and we're going to do what we can to transform you, whether by persuasion or by force. Now, in that case, I think you may be pushed to the point where you have to either defend yourself practically or engage in some kind of activity that does more than just talk to people who don't want to engage in any conversation. But in the first instance, I think the only thing you can do is talk. And also, I think, in the end, the only thing you can really do is talk. Because even if you go to war, every war ends. I mean, some of them may take 100 years, but they will end. And they will always end with talking. Because that's how things get settled. Even if you wipe out the other side, to a very substantial degree, you still end up talking. Now, you may say there are a couple of examples that are exceptions to this. The Romans, when they finally beat the Carthaginians, went to Carthage and razed it to the ground and killed everyone. I mean, that is pretty rare. I mean, most of the time, what happens is that people are trying to convert, transform, not to eliminate, in which case it's always going to end up with some sort of dialogue. And I think that's as much as you can really say, because you can't establish at the outset some set of values or principles that you can say, well, these are the things that have to be appealed to convince people of something, and that's how you will get somewhere. Because it almost certainly will be the case. You only get somewhere by the process of dialogue, interaction, conversation, and so on, at the beginning and I think at the end.
What about the case of people who do not have the power to really effect change or really have a say in the compromise of values in society? So we can think of, in the real world, the extreme disadvantage in society. I mean, they necessarily have to live in that society or association or, you know, social body. But because of their disadvantage in society, they may not have as much of a say in the kind of compromise of values that society reaches. So, how do you think? How would you deal with this problem?
Well, for people in those circumstances, I think there are two things that can happen. One is that individuals in that situation can themselves take risks, become politically active, become intellectually and socially active, to try to start movements for change. And I think this has happened. The other thing that can happen, as either as an alternative or simultaneously with this, is that others who share their attitudes, even if they're not members of the same minority, can take up the struggle on behalf of other people. And I think this is not an unusual thing. So to take a couple of examples, struggles for civil rights in the United States did involve many African Americans trying to stand up for their rights, but they were also helped by large numbers of sympathizers from other races who argued for, struggled for a kind of political transformation. And I think there was a lot of success that was won by this, even though for a long, long time these people were, as the descendants of slavery, a very, very embattled and put down minority. You could say a similar thing for gay rights. 50 years ago, the circumstances of gay people was very, very different than it is now. It's not because there are suddenly a greater number of them, but there was enough sympathy among other people for their condition that changes could come about. So I think it's still possible, even if you are in a very small minority.
But these examples that you have suggested are premised on there being a reasonable accessibility to free speech, reasonable accessibility to political participation. But what about the case of an absolute dictatorship where there is no freedom of speech? What about the disadvantage in that society if they don't believe in the same values of absolutist dictatorship that society would, that the rest of that society would even?
I think it just makes it harder. It doesn't make it impossible. And I think one of the reasons why it's not impossible is that it's rare for a society to be completely undivided, in which case it may be possible for those who are in the minority to form alliances with others with similar interests, even though they may also be very, very different, very diverse in other respects. But I don't want to make this sound like in everywhere things are possible. It's not a kind of can-do optimism that I'm preaching. It's it's much more difficult, for example, I think, to reform certain institutions in a place like Saudi Arabia than it is to effect, I would think, reform in Indonesia, because you've got a different political structure, you've got a different set of background conditions. And in some places it may just be that the regime is so repressive it makes it very difficult for dissent to become effective. It's hard to see how things will change in North Korea. But even there, I think eventually things will change, because there are people who see that there's something wrong. and will have an interest in working towards this. I remember in the 1970s and 80s, people generally thought that the Soviet Union would last for hundreds of years. A few people saw it as something that would collapse, but of course it did. Even though the regime looked like it had a very, very firm grip on the society. Well, I think one doesn't really know, but it would be foolish to say that there are societies where it would be extremely difficult.
So going back to the original theme of liberalism, are these difficult societies, maybe North Korea is too difficult an example, but say for example Saudi Arabia, do you think they are at least minimally liberal in the sense that you just mentioned, that at least the values that are in the society are a product of compromise of values amongst the population, which may inevitably be subject to some inequalities of bargaining power, but still, they can still be sort of minimally liberal in this sense?
Because I don't really know enough about Saudi Arabia to be confident about what I say there, and the part of it is I don't know what the divisions are in the society, and also in a society like Saudi Arabia, you've not got a democratic regime in which there are plural interests that express themselves through an open political process. So any change that's going to come about is going to come about, working against a regime that has its own independent source of power and wealth. But that said, I mean, it's also well known that the regime is a very unstable one, because it's one in which there's a great deal of disaffection for all sorts of reasons. So change could come about even in a place like Saudi Arabia. Now, given the events of the last 2 years, one has to point out that this does not necessarily mean that if things move in a more radical direction, there's more criticism and ultimately a challenge to a regime, that everything will turn out well. So you look at Libya and Syria right now, it looks like a complete disaster. Okay, so it's not the case that just because a liberal regime is challenged, that what you will get is a more liberal, more tolerant, more open kind of outcome. That may not be the case.
But at least in the abstract, can a absolutist dictatorship, which is authoritarian, which severely curtails freedom of speech, severely curtails freedom of political participation, can it be minimally liberal in the sense that you mentioned?
Well, I suppose it depends on how minimal liberalism is. So for me, there has to be a significant toleration for dissent and let's just call it exit from the prevailing norms. That is to say, there must be some possibility that you can carve out a space for yourself to act according to your own norms. It may not be perfect, but there's some space. And I think there are probably quite a few regimes in the world which are not minimally liberal in that sense. But the more liberal you are, the more willing you are to let people find their own way, both individually and collectively.
And about this question of freedom of dissent. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not just limited to the freedom to think differently. It extends to the freedom to actually express a different view to others. And to a certain extent, this may require some resources. Does your requirement of sort of minimal liberalism, not deep liberalism, nevertheless require that individuals be entitled to resources to express their views?
That's a good question, and it puts a view that many liberals have advanced.
And of course, the same applies to exit rights, for example. I mean, in many cases, in the real world, you could say that someone has the freedom and right to exit a country if he doesn't agree with the kind of compromise of values that the country subscribes to, and join another country where its compromise of values is more agreeable to it. But really, that's quite difficult for some people because of the social economic circumstances that's here.
Yeah. You're quite right that we do need resources sometimes to be more effective. And if you haven't got resources, the right to think and act differently may be pretty cheap right. But that said, there is a worry that comes with saying that everybody has some kind of right or entitlement to the resources necessary. Because once you say that, then you've really got to establish what those rights are, what those resources are, and who is responsible for supplying those resources. Now, that puts the whole question of the distribution of resources back into the center, and requires that you establish some kind of authority that is in the business of handing out those resources. In which case, what you then get is people competing for those resources by tailoring their claims to the rules that are now established by the authority that's been established as the entity that's going to settle these sorts of questions. The worry, I think, in all of this is simply that this is making this question determined not by the interaction of groups and people who may transcend different borders and boundaries and so on. What it risks doing is setting up precisely what I said at the beginning I was concerned about, which is something like a closed society in which the division of resources is settled centrally. One of the reasons why you want this freedom of dissent is to challenge the center. But if, whether or not you can have the resources you need is going to be determined by the center, I think you're back with the original problem. The center is going to determine who's going to get the resources. So in that sense, I'd say better to say, just take your chances. Is it that difficult to come up with the resources to challenge authority, or to exit, or to move, or to dissent? I don't think so. I mean, to give you an example, in the case of exit, the world's refugee camps are full of people who are among the poorest. And how have they managed to exit? Well, they find all kinds of ways. Families have pooled their resources to allow the sons to escape, hoping that when the sons escape, they will then find the resources to either return and help the others, or send resources to help the others. Or maybe it's just to flee, because in some cases, the Taliban, for example, are targeting young men, so important to let them escape. There are all kinds of ways in which people can come up with means and so on. But to take the attitude that, well, everybody's entitled to the means that you've got to establish some kind of mechanism for distributing the means, and then you're going to give power to the center. And that's what you're worried about if you want to make sure that dissenters aren't going to be subject to that sort of control and power.
And of course, in this conception of liberalism, the right to exit doesn't necessarily entitle you to a right of entry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. What is the implication that you want to draw from this?
So, the point that I was making was rather that in this liberal social order, although you may have massive amounts of refugees, the fact that it's liberal doesn't require other states to accept these refugees.
I think it does. Maybe require to be understood in one way rather than another. It means require here suggests not that there's got to be a legal obligation, but rather for such a society to work, it's necessary that there be places that are willing to accept people who want to move into them. So in principle, if you had a world in which other societies were not willing to admit people, then a liberal order would be difficult, not impossible. So for example, supposing the world were divided up not into different jurisdictions, which was, say, for example, geographical, but into different communities that were associated through kinship systems. Well, you could only move, let's say hypothetically, from one group to another if you were in the right kinship network. Well, that might turn out to be a very closed society because in that sort of system, your movement is really curtailed by the fact that if you don't have the right connection, you can't move. Well, a system like that, in which human relations are organized in this way, will probably never become a liberal system. It will be one in which people could not really leave one community and enter another. It would also be a system in which people are very unlikely to develop a way of thinking that might lead them to actually move away and form another society altogether. So I think liberalism, in that sense, does require a certain kind of thinking implicit in the views of the population, and the absence of certain kinds of institutions which might make it impossible for people to even conceive of moving.
I'm going to round off the discussion because I think it's definitely time for Q&A already. Prof, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Malaysian context.
A little bit.
Do you think Malaysia ought to be more liberal in the sense that we've just discussed? And what sort of practical kind of changes need to be made?
Okay, maybe I'll say less about the practical changes, but a little bit more about the liberalism. Now, in one sense, it seems to me that Malaysia is naturally a place that should be a liberal society, and is already a place which I think naturally has a great deal of liberalism in it. Because to begin with, it's a society that's very diverse linguistically, culturally, and religiously. And it's also a society that is politically pluralistic. There are lots of different peoples who live in Malaysia. They have lots of different traditions and ways and practices. We've got, apart from the Indians and the Chinese and the Malays, you've also got Sarawak, Iban and Khukatas, and people of mixed descent. In different parts of the country, you've got all kinds of people. You've got the Nyonya in Malacca, so on. You've got different ways of living, from rural Malays to urban Malays, Indians who've grown up in rubber estates to those who are in the professions. So it's a very, very diverse society. It's also a society that's a very modern one, in the sense that it's a society that has a very, very substantial English tradition because of its history of colonization. It's also had long-standing interaction with Europe because of previous colonizers, the Portuguese and the Dutch. It's also been a kind of center for trade because people from China, Japan, to all parts of Europe have found themselves crossing paths at this intersection. So it's a very diverse society, and it's a society which historically has allowed all of these people to interact, to intermingle, and ultimately to actually form a society on independence. It was a liberal society, it has been, in that sense, a liberal society for most of its existence, both before independence and since. So that, I think, is in a sense the real Malaysian tradition. Now, given that, it's not all that difficult for a society like that. The problem, I think, will come because there are different groups always in any society that want to read some particular view that they favor into the tradition, because there's some particular advantage to them, either because they want to promote some particular value, or I think even more likely because there's some political advantage to be gained by saying, no, this is how you should read the tradition. So I think in Malaysia right now there's a great deal of argument from some sides of politics to say, no, this is actually much more of a non-Western country, a non-liberal country. In some parts even to say it's much more a Muslim country. But if you look at the constitution, it is a liberal constitution. It was the constitution that was established on independence, many, many times, but essentially a constitution that said it is a society of many different races and traditions, and everybody has a place. Well, that's liberalism. Now, you can still debate how much of this you want, in what sense it needs to be modified, but that tradition is a liberal tradition. I think the anti-liberal elements in the society are really going against the history of Malaysia, both as a country and as a region.
Okay. So in that spirit of